Content warning. This video is going to feature some video game footage that involves flashing lights, body horror, pixel art style, gore, and just a general deliberately unsettling vibe. So, I would understand entirely if you decide to just step out on this one. Tamashii is a 2018 puzzle platformer game, which feels, to me, weirdly nostalgic in a way that I didn't understand until I looked into the person who made it. The game is, at its heart, a fairly classic type of indie platformer. It's one where you play a small, big-headed individual in a horrible world, trying to work out what exactly the story of the game is while you are doing your best to get by bit by bit, with like one basic puzzle mechanic that you're expected to iterate on a dozen times. In this case, the thing you're meant to be iterating on is the ability to drop copies of yourself, timed skulls that let you hold down switches and move past buttons and all that stuff. Otherwise, it's, a fairly standard modern controller-based puzzle platformer. I've played a lot of these. They are generally all pretty good. And if your main thought is, hey, I like these, should I try this? This is definitely another one. What makes this game weirdly nostalgic for me is exactly why it felt familiar. Now, it's not just because, hey, look, it's another one of these puzzly platformer games and they all feel kind of familiar to me at this point. It's instead that when you get down to it, this is a game of a kind that I used to see a lot. Way back in the 1990s, free games were differently available. You could go on the internet and use BBS software and all sorts of other different download options to get your hands on things that we would consider now to be like indie games, but there were erratic limits on that. You couldn't be sure how much of it you'd find, and some of it was just really bad. Also, internet connections at the time being what they were, games that were too large were just not going to be made available. If I wanted to get a copy of Tyrion off the, at the time, nascent internet, I would probably have to spend most of a day downloading it. But back at this time, video games were also a great kind of value-added proposition for magazines. See, a magazine is a format of advertising where they take a tree, hammer it flat and fold it in half, and then on some of the pages of hammered flat paper, they will then convince you to try and buy particular pieces of software or hardware or sign up for mailing lists or whatever. It used to be, back in the dawn of these computer magazines, that some of them would move a diskette, a 3.5-inch floppy, which would then make, have some stuff on it that you could make some use out of. And these were reasonably cool little things. When the CD-ROM happened, though, everything exploded. Because suddenly these games, which were designed to be moved on the 3.5 floppy, were being moved on a format that could handle 600 times what a floppy could. So demos got bigger, sure, but also magazines would have 100, 200 megabytes of free space sitting around on this CD that they're going to cut anyway. And they did have good internet connections. So they would often download shareware versions of games and distribute them along with all their other software on these CDs, serving as a sort of distribution vector, a kind of proto-internet. Once upon a time, we used to call them sneakernets, where you would put things on a easily physically transferred medium and sneak it around. During this time, I played a lot of weird crap, because it wasn't just being filtered through general advertising schedules. What was happening was you were getting developers from all over the world putting things on the internet, and whatever happened to get the attention of like Paul Pettingale from PC Format wound up getting onto the CD-ROM, which meant that for a while there I saw a lot of games that kind of don't stick in the memory long term, but when I do see them show up on shows like Retronauts or on the Cusa Grande tournaments, I'm like, oh yeah, I've played this. And that can occasionally be quite upsetting for all of my friends who are like, why do you know about this Drek? Because, I don't know, they were all console people. Tamashii feels like the platonic ideal of some of those games. It is really, really good by the standards of a bygone era where a game couldn't reliably have enough levels to finish itself. The thing is, when you were seeing these games, you were often seeing things created with dozens of different weird influences that you weren't necessarily expecting. That meant that you got to see some really messed up stuff. There's a surprising number of shareware games from this period of time which just happen to have, hentai in them on some screen because who's going to check after level 3 or something like that? You also got to acquaint yourself with the wonderful categories of what happens when other countries are making games with frames of references you've never heard of, like the category of first-person shooters we now call Slavjank thanks to Civi, or the cousin of that, games like Sango Fighter, games being made out of the non-Japan parts of Asia that nonetheless felt kind of anime to our very limited perspective at the time. Tamashii is the creation of a Brazilian designer reinventing VHS aesthetics of Japanese video games and media that is now itself a relic. The irony is that this game looks so much worse than its technical requirements would suggest it needs to be, because this game isn't just janked up visually, this game is doing its absolute best to make sure that janked up status is all overlaying a very carefully constructed whole. There are options to slow the game down, and there are options to get rid of this flashing visual aesthetic that lets you play through the game in a more conventionally structured way. But if you can handle it, and if the visual aesthetic doesn't unsettle you too much, there is a really interesting game here, which is specifically playing with mediums that it isn't anymore. This isn't a 3.5-inch floppy game. This isn't a shareware game being distributed on discs. This isn't being put onto CRT screens with their artifacts and fuzziness. This is a modern game that has put an enormous amount of work into not just replicating the way those things looked, but the way that they felt. Tamashii is a delightful little puzzle game, and if you can handle the kinds of ways it wants to be macabre, and the ways that it plays with your perception of flesh and eyes and eternity, then you should give it a look.